What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to The Haunted Beard. Once again, my name is Jake. Thank you for joining me today. Well, today's video, I am continuing, in fact, wrapping up, really, my Saw series of reviews and talking about Spiral, the spin-off from 2021. And this was a first-time watch for me. I just gave it a watch the other night and wanted to give you my thoughts to get this thing all wrapped up, so let's get into this. So Spiral, from the Book of Saw, tells the story of Detective Zeke Banks and his rookie partner, who take charge of a grisly investigation into murders that are eerily reminiscent of the city's gruesome past. So Spiral takes place in the same universe as Saw, where John Kramer, who is now deceased and has been deceased, but is an actual character and is well known amongst the characters in this movie. And so the new killer that we get here is a copycat killer. And so the film starts off very reminiscent, very similar to the other Saw films, in that we get a kill sequence, sort of a trap sequence to kind of set things off. And we are at this like 4th of July party, and this cop goes down into the subway tunnel to chase this perpetrator who just like mugged a woman or something like that. And he ends up getting captured, getting tied up. He gets locked up right on the subway tracks, and he's chained up, hanging from the ceiling, and his tongue is locked into this device. And he has got to essentially pull and rip out his own tongue to free himself from the trap before the subway comes down and wipes him out. And of course, he doesn't do it in time. And so the movie starts off with a nice, just kind of gnarly gross, gory kill as that subway just splat and freaking takes this guy out. And so we definitely feel like we are in typical sort of Saw territory. And so the movie really kicks things off in a very similar way to what we are familiar with. We're then introduced to Detective Zeke Banks, played by Chris Rock, as he is undercover. And Chris Rock here, I'll just kind of comment and give you some thoughts about his performance. Overall, I was pretty happy with his performance overall. I think he did a pretty solid job. You can definitely tell he plays more into kind of the comedic side and is more comfortable in delivering the comedy than the straight up emotions and drama and things like that. But he definitely shines when you can kind of tell they just sort of let him loose to just kind of riff and vent. And so the opening scene, we introduce him, he's talking with these guys he's undercover with, who are all the bad guys. They're getting ready to like rob this place, and he's just kind of venting on Forrest Gump. And it's just kind of this funny thing. You can tell they probably just gave Chris Rock sort of free rein to just kind of go off and you know, say whatever he wanted to. And so, and there's a few moments like that in the movie where just sort of his natural sense of humor, his natural comedian skills really kind of come out and shine, and I really like that. He leans into that a little bit. I wish they would have let him do it a little bit more, because I think it just comes through his character. It's not like he's just intentionally trying to tell jokes to get us to laugh. It's just part of his character. It's part of who he is. And overall, I think it works pretty well. And for the most part, I was pretty satisfied with his performance. I thought he services the film well enough and gives us an interesting enough protagonist that we are interested in and care about. As the film progresses, we learn a little bit more of his backstory and things like that. And so overall, I thought he did a pretty good job. So we learn early on in the movie that he is more or less an outcast at the police station that he works at, because a few years prior to the events of the movie, he turned in a dirty cop and reported him for an illegal shooting. And now everybody is against him because he's a snitch, he's a rat, and so he's just kind of the outcast there. And what ends up happening is we find out that the cop who dies in the opening scene is sort of the one friend that he had, the one guy who sort of had his back. And so the death there really affects him personally. And then we're introduced to Detective Shank, played by Max Minghella, who is the rookie cop who's now going to be Chris Rock's new partner. So what we end up finding out is that the new, I'll just call him the Spiral Killer in this case, his motivation is that he is going after dirty cops. and there's a lot of corruption within the police precinct where they work at. And so it gives the killer here, I think, a pretty good and compelling sort of motivation. He's not just this straight up, psychopath, maniacal serial killer who's just after people just to kill people. He's got a legitimate motivation and legitimate reasons, and you can understand why he is choosing to kill these cops because they're crooked and they're corrupt, and so it definitely adds. It just makes things more interesting and kind of more complex. It's not so good versus bad type deal. And so I like that they add a little bit of a layer of depth there as far as the motivation behind the new killer here. And I like too what they do with Spiral is I feel that they kind of get back to the basics a little bit. It's pretty obvious with the later Saw installments that really everything is just built around the traps, and we're just there to see some gruesome, gory torture and some crazy, ridiculous traps. And that's more or less kind of that's the selling point for those movies. And I like here what Spiral does in that it uses the story first and foremost. It's not as concerned with the traps and just giving us blood and guts. It's concerned first and foremost with a story, and it's a detective story and a mystery story, and it uses the traps and the kill scenes to kind of heighten that story, and it doesn't build everything around the traps. And so I appreciate that they kind of were more focused on the story and really just kind of got back to the basics of this thing. And overall, I think the traps here are pretty good. I wouldn't say that they are the best of the series, but even if they're not, extreme and over the top gory and all that stuff, they're not necessarily as memorable in terms of gore. I like more that they're there not to be the selling point, that they're there ultimately to kind of serve the story. And so so the traps and the kills that you get make sense within the story, and why the killer chooses these traps makes sense. They're kind of built around each dirty cop that he's going after, and they kind of connect to something that the cop has done. And so I kind of like that aspect of it as well. I think the traps serve the story well overall. Now, in terms of the actual story structure regarding Spiral, it is told somewhat similarly to the majority of the other Saw films, where you kind of have, I wouldn't say there's two different timelines, but a lot of the Saw films will have sort of your main timeline, and then will include some flashbacks, and Spiral does that as well. But I like here that while typically the flashbacks in the other Saw films will focus on kind of different characters, the flashbacks we get here are flashback into Zeke's past, and it kind of just it gives you an opportunity to kind of really sort of develop his character more. I think he is one of the better Saw characters in this entire series, and one of the most developed characters, and a lot of times flashbacks when they're used are oftentimes kind of giving us unnecessary information that I often wish we could have found out in a different way. That the information usually done in a flashback is sometimes just kind of a cheap way to give you information. And I think in a way you can kind of make that same complaint here. However, I just find it interesting kind of character development. And so, we're finding out about all this conflict and all the stuff that is going on, and why he's this outcast in his police precinct, and then you kind of start peeling back the layers and stuff. And so I think for the most part it does a pretty good job just kind of adding depth to his character. And so I think because of that, where they're really focusing on character and not just giving you information to kind of fill in gaps, I think the flashbacks here and in the story structure being told that way, I think overall it works pretty well. Pretty soon we are introduced to Samuel L. Jackson in this movie, and he plays Chris Rock's dad. And I have to say I enjoyed him in here. He more or less, this is Samuel L. Jackson just simply playing Samuel L. Jackson, but I'm not going to complain about it. And so I like there's a couple good scenes of him and Chris Rock just kind of father-son dynamic that works pretty well. It's just kind of fun to watch both of these guys just kind of play off one another and kind of just see their interaction and things like that. And so I enjoyed that aspect. I'm never going to complain with Samuel L. Jackson's on screen just doing what Samuel L. Jackson does. So overall, I enjoyed his performance in this movie. Now, in terms of how everything kind of unfolds and develops and plays out and everything, I think for the most part, it's decent. It is, if I mean, if you've seen typical sort of detective thriller murder mysteries, this isn't really doing anything out of the ordinary, especially if you've seen some of the Saw movies, right? And so, for the most part, everything kind of plays out fairly straightforward, right? You got another body, and then what the spiral killer ends up doing is, he's sending packages into Chris Rock at the precinct, and he's opening and playing these little video clips from these USB drives, and that takes him to a location, and so, they're just kind of tracking down leads and following leads and things like that. And so it's nothing mind blowing. It's nothing we haven't seen before. It's decent enough, and it moves along at a fairly quick pace. The pacing here, there's not really any low points or anything like that. It doesn't drag, and so it moves along fairly well and keeps your interest throughout the majority of it. And so it just kind of plays out how you would sort of expect. Now, full transparency, even though this was my first watch, I unfortunately had the ending spoiled for me. So I knew who the killer was. And so I can't technically say that I figured out who it was before the reveal. However, if I had to put money on it, I'd be willing to bet I probably could have figured it out. And I think people who are kind of familiar with, again, these sort of detective murder mysteries, there's a couple things that happen that if you're kind of paying close enough attention, you'd probably be able to kind of put two and two together and sort of figure it out. Also, I was able to predict, and I think it's fairly easy to be able to predict, that everything was going to lead to a climax involving Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson, and then obviously the reveal of the killer. And I kind of knew that the killer was going to, get Samuel L. Jackson and have him trapped, and that was going to lead him into, Chris Rock having to go save his dad. And so it's I'd say fairly obvious that's kind of where it's headed. And so ultimately, in the end, you get this reveal that it is the new rookie partner played by Max Minghella who is the spiral killer. He is the son of the guy who Chris Rock's partner shot. And so he's been harboring this, revenge in his heart throughout his entire life, and he wants to get back at the police. So that's why he's targeted all these dirty cops. And he's got Samuel L. Jackson, and Chris Rock has to make a decision if he's going to, free his dad with one bullet left, or if he's going to kill Max Minghella. And so ultimately he decides to free his dad. However, Spiral Killer has outsmarted him because he's got him rigged with this sort of, I don't know, mechanical arm device and a gun attached to his arm. So when the SWAT team invades, it looks like he's going to try to shoot him. He also learns too that his dad has been a corrupt cop just as well. And so it's kind of this big twist as well. But then he ends up getting shot by the SWAT team, and then the Spiral Killer gets away. And the kind of the final ending sequence is pretty good. It's definitely reminiscent of, at least in a way, of the original Saw movie. At least from a musical perspective, they click in that Saw theme, and it really kind of gives you sort of a flashback to that final scene in the original Saw movie. So I thought that was a nice touch, just a little bit of an homage there to the OG. And the actual ending, though, is kind of a little weird and kind of a little abrupt. And so Chris Rock and Minghella are fighting in this, elevator lift, and the SWAT team invades, and Chris Rock, is like, yeah, don't shoot. And then Max kind of just backs into the elevator and hits the button and starts going down. And then the movie just cuts to black. And it's just kind of a weird spot to end it on. It's like kind of a total cliffhanger, I guess, because it's like, well, the whole building is surrounded by cops, and it's like he's just in this like elevator. Like, are we supposed to expect that he got away or what? And so anyway, I don't know, I just kind of thought the actual ending, like the last 30 seconds, was just kind of really weird. And so it doesn't really give us like an actual ending. It doesn't really give us a conclusion. I mean, I guess that kind of makes sense, because if there's one thing we've learned about Saw movies, is that they're always looking to make another one. And so perhaps we'll get a sequel to Spiral. So Overall, it's a decent enough watch. It's fine. There's some stuff here to appreciate. It does look pretty nice just in terms of a visual perspective. They seemingly pumped more money into this than they have at least the last handful of Saw movies, and so you got kind of some nice colors and cinematography here, things like that. And so it's a decent watch. There's nothing great about it. It, like I said, it just kind of has a nice sort of murder mystery thriller vibe to it with some cool, torture traps and kills and stuff like that. And so um, I'm not like super high on this one. I'm not super low overall. Like I enjoyed myself enough and had a decent enough time with it. And so yeah, I think for overall grade on this one, I'm probably a touch above sort of the middle of the road. I'm, 5.5, maybe a 6 out of 10, something like that. And so those are my thoughts on Spiral. So I will say, though, I wouldn't mind maybe a follow-up just because of how this thing ended. It just kind of felt so weird and like we don't really fully get a conclusion. So I wouldn't mind if they decided to make another one. I'd check it out. So those are my thoughts on Spiral. Hit me up down below in the comments. Let me know what your guys' thoughts were. That concludes the Saw series of reviews, but I am going to finalize this whole thing with doing a Saw series ranking to cap this thing off. So be on the lookout. Stay tuned for that. That will be coming up soon. Thank you so much for watching. If you like content like this, hit that subscribe button. This is what I do on the Haunted Beard, horror and thriller movie content coming at you. I greatly appreciate it, and I'll see you next time on the Haunted Beard.